April 8, 1943, 27,000 feet above occupied France. The sky was so clear it felt like glass, sharp and endless, the kind of cold blue that made the horizon look like a knife. Inside his Focke-Wulf 190A5, Oberleutnant Karl Weiss adjusted his oxygen mask and smiled beneath the rubber edges. Below, lumbering upward through the thin air, came the strangers. New Americans, big swollen silhouettes rising toward his formation. His lips curled as the thought became words, clipped and sharp through the static of his radio. Flaggende Milchflaschen. Flying milk bottles. The laughter from his wingman snapped through the headset, harsh and metallic in the oxygen hiss. They had seen sleek Spitfires, nimble Yaks, swift Laggs, machines built for speed and clawing turns. But these Americans had brought barrels into the sky. Fat fuselages, greenhouse canopies, propellers as wide as barn doors. They climbed like oxen dragging wagons uphill. It was absurd. Weiss steadied his machine and peered through the canopy. The P-47 Thunderbolts, that was what intelligence had named them, looked too big, too heavy, too clumsy. The kind of aircraft that would bleed speed in a turn, break wings in a dive, and never catch an enemy once the fight turned vertical. To the Luftwaffe, veterans now of 3.5 years of war, they seemed like mistakes in aluminum. But even as he laughed, Weiss felt something else. A low vibration, faint at first, carried not through the radio, but through the air itself. It was not the scream of Daimler-Benz engines, nor the sharp whistle of a Messerschmitt's dive. This was deeper, heavier, a sound you felt in the chest. The first tracers began to climb, lazy at a distance, hungry up close, glowing dots that stitched the sky in red-orange. Weiss tilted his head, confused. They weren't firing in bursts like German cannon. They weren't measured shots from disciplined bursts. The Americans were speaking in an entirely new language. 8 50 caliber Brownings all opening up at once, continuous, mechanical, unrelenting. It was not music. It was a wall of sound, a piano of Roosevelt, as the Germans would later call it. Roosevelt's piano. The sky flickered. A canopy somewhere in the formation bloomed with sparks. A Bf-109 on the far edge of Weiss's vision broke apart like glass under pressure, its tail shearing away, the nose plunging earthward in fire. The laughter in his ears cut short. Someone tried a joke, swallowed it half-finished. Then silence. The P-47s had stopped climbing. They had begun something different, something Weiss had never truly seen. They did not turn to dance. They did not claw for angles. They simply rolled over, pointed their noses down, and fell with purpose. Weiss yanked at the stick, instinct calling for the old maneuver. Reversal, climb, drag them into a turning fight. But the air was thin, resistant. The controls pushed back. His BMW 801 engine coughed and clawed, trying to keep pace, but the Thunderbolts were already in their dive. The first one tore past his canopy, close enough for Weiss to see the rivets in its skin, close enough to see the black canopy glass and the shadow of a pilot inside. The sound was unbearable, like canvas tearing, like thunder chained inside steel. On the ground, men would later remember this noise. Farmers, villagers, Wehrmacht troops, they all would say the same thing. You heard it before you saw it, that rolling, booming roar. And once you heard it, you looked for ditches. You prayed for cover. You prayed the hammer wasn't meant for you. Weiss tried to catch them in a turn. Too late. The American had leveled out, lined up his shot, and let the convergence of 8 Brownings find its mark. The tracers weren't strings. They weren't dots. They were a wall. The Messerschmitt caught in the stream didn't fall. It didn't glide. It disintegrated, tail one way, nose the other, fragments flashing like dying stars. Weiss pulled, breathing hard, his mask fogging. The radio was chaos now, clipped shouts, curses, orders. But the laughter was gone, entirely gone. The Americans had arrived. Days later, across briefing rooms in Luftwaffe headquarters, the reports arrived. Jagdgeschwader 26 had engaged new American fighters. Heavy, slow, ridiculous in appearance, but dangerous in a dive. Dangerous with their guns. Unorthodox. Their weaknesses were clear. They could not climb well. They could not turn well. Easy prey in traditional dogfights. But if they were allowed to dive, if they were allowed to point those 8 Brownings, the sky turned red. In English ready rooms on the other side of the channel, the mood was different. The Americans were nervous, sweating, checking the straps of parachutes again and again. Most had never fired a shot in anger. They looked at the bulk of their machines and wondered if they had been betrayed by their own engineers. The British pilots teased them, calling the P-47s bathtubs with wings, milk trucks. And the Americans laughed too, nervous laughter, the kind you use to cover doubt. But men like Major Hubert "Hub" Zemke, commander of the 56th Fighter Group, saw something else. He hated the machine at first. Too heavy, too stubborn, too dangerous in the hands of rookies. It had killed men in training, far more than the Luftwaffe had so far. But Zemke was no fool. He studied the statistics, he watched his men learn, and he began to understand. The Thunderbolt was not meant to be flown like a Spitfire or like a Messerschmitt. It was not meant to twirl and pirouette in the sky. It was meant to be aimed, to be hurled, to be used like a weapon of inevitability. The Germans mocked it. The British doubted it. Even the Americans feared it. But in time, all of them would remember it. They would remember the sound. They would remember the red tracers. They would remember the moment when the sky itself changed color. The veterans on both sides, years later, would speak of that spring of 1943 with the same tone. The shock of underestimation. The speed with which mockery turned to fear. Weiss survived that day. Many of his comrades did not. His laughter was gone, replaced by a silence he never forgot. He would carry it into every mission after. For the men in Thunderbolts, it was baptism by fire. They were laughed at, ridiculed, even by their allies. But those who strapped into the heavy cockpit, who pushed the throttle forward and felt the R-2800 scream, they would never forget what happened when 8 Brownings fired together. April 1943 had begun with jokes. It ended with silence. And in between, the sky turned red. The first weeks of combat were brutal lessons written in fire and steel. The P-47 Thunderbolt, mocked as overweight and clumsy, proved every German prejudice correct, at least on the surface. Pilots of Jagdgeschwader 26 and Jagdgeschwader 2 tore into the newcomers with contemptuous ease. The Americans tried to fight the way they had trained in Texan skies, turning tightly, clawing for altitude, seeking duels of maneuver. But the Thunderbolt was no duelist. It was a hammer forced into the role of a rapier, and the Luftwaffe cut it to pieces. 14 Thunderbolts were lost in that first month, against only 3 confirmed kills. In briefing rooms across England, young American pilots slumped in silence as chalkboards filled with names of men who did not return. British officers shook their heads and whispered doubts. Perhaps they should have brought more Spitfires. RAF pilots, sharp in their tailored uniforms, offered sardonic smiles. One quipped that the best evasive maneuver in a P-47 was to unstrap and run around its cockpit, roomy enough for a man to stretch while the war tore outside. The Luftwaffe laughed hardest of all. Oberst Joseph Pips Priller, ace of JG-26, filed a report dripping with scorn. The new American fighter is meat for the slaughter. It flies like a truck, turns like a freight train, climbs like a pregnant cow. Our boys call them fat targets pretending to be warriors. The words spread through the German squadrons like wildfire. The Americans had sent milk bottles into combat. Heavy pigs that could not dance. Jokes were made, sketches drawn on ready-room boards, laughter ringing in hangars. The Luftwaffe had faced Spitfires, Hurricanes, Yaks, all worthy adversaries. Against the Thunderbolt, they felt invincible. But beneath the laughter, something unsettling was happening. Engineers combing through damaged Thunderbolts back in England began to notice patterns. Aircraft riddled with cannon holes, wings slashed with machine gun fire, engines scarred by shrapnel, and yet they returned. A P-47 landed with 21 20mm holes and more than 100 punctures from smaller caliber fire. The canopy shattered, hydraulic lines severed, but the pilot alive. Another came back with its tail half torn away. Another limped in on a single cylinder coughing, its fuselage stitched like cloth under a tailor's needle. German cannon fire, so devastating against Spitfires and Yaks, seemed strangely blunted against the Thunderbolt's thick radial engine and rugged frame. Where liquid-cooled fighters died with a single coolant leak, the P-47 shrugged off punishment like a stubborn bull. The Americans did not yet realize it, but the very bulk they cursed was their salvation. The Thunderbolt could take what others could not. And when it struck back, when those 8 Brownings spoke, the results were terrifying. It took one man to reveal the truth to the world. His name was Robert S. Johnson. Johnson was a farm boy from Oklahoma, 23 years old, with the square jaw of a young boxer and the quiet confidence of a man raised under open skies. He had trained in Spitfires with the RAF before joining the 61st Fighter Squadron. The Spitfire was nimble, elegant, responsive. The Thunderbolt was not, yet Johnson found something intoxicating in the cockpit of the P-47. It was like strapping yourself to a locomotive, he would later say. The power was unbelievable. You didn't fly it, you aimed it. On June 26, 1943, Johnson flew escort over France when his squadron was ambushed by 16 Focke-Wulf 190s, led by Hauptmann Wilhelm Galland, younger brother of Adolf Galland. The Germans struck with textbook precision, diving from the sun, engines screaming, guns blazing. Johnson's Thunderbolt was caught at the rear, the perfect target. The first seconds were chaos. Cannon shells exploded across his fuselage. One tore through his canopy, showering his face with glass. Shrapnel ripped into his nose and leg. Hydraulic fluid sprayed across the cockpit, stinging his eyes. Fire erupted near the instrument panel, heat rolling over him. Johnson reached for the canopy release. Jammed. A 20mm shell had exploded in the track, welding it shut. He was trapped. His engine shook violently. Smoke poured from the cowling. The controls stiffened with every passing heartbeat. At 27,000 feet, bleeding and half-blinded, Robert Johnson was flying a dying machine. And yet, it flew. The Thunderbolt refused to surrender. Johnson forced the stick forward, leveled, and aimed for England. The oil smeared his windscreen until he could see nothing but shifting shadows. The cockpit smelled of cordite, hydraulic fluid, and blood. Each second was a lifetime. He was certain it would explode, that he would die in fire before he ever saw the channel. But the P-47 endured. Then came the Hunter. A lone Focke-Wulf 190, likely from Galland's Staffel, closed in. The German positioned behind him and fired. 4 20mm cannons and 2 machine guns spat death into Johnson's crippled Thunderbolt. Explosions rocked the frame. The armor plate behind his seat rang like a gong. His skin prickled with each near miss. The German fired again. And again. Johnson braced, certain the next burst would tear him apart. But the Thunderbolt absorbed it. The armor deflected. The engine shook but kept turning. The controls quivered but still answered. The German repositioned, perhaps disbelieving. He fired until his cannons ran dry. Then he poured his machine gun ammunition into the American. Still, the Thunderbolt flew. Finally, the Focke-Wulf pulled alongside. Johnson glanced sideways through his cracked canopy and saw the pilot's face. Young, blonde, handsome, expression shifting from triumph to confusion to fear. The German shook his head slowly. Then, in a gesture that transcended war, he raised his hand, gave a small salute, and banked away. Out of ammunition, out of options, out of belief. Johnson's Thunderbolt limped back across the channel and crash-landed in Manston. The ground crew counted bullet holes until they stopped at 200. 3 of the main fuselage longerons, the backbone of the aircraft, were shot clean through. The canopy was welded shut with metal shards. The engine block was scarred with impacts, yet the machine had carried its pilot home. The story spread like wildfire. To American pilots, it was proof. To British skeptics, it was revelation. To German intelligence, it was nightmare. A single Thunderbolt had absorbed everything a Focke-Wulf could throw at it and refused to die. The laughter stopped. From that day forward, a shadow crept into the Luftwaffe's confidence. Reports filtered upward, reluctant at first, then urgent. Enemy fighter shows unusual resistance to damage. Cannons ineffective unless direct cockpit strike. Recommend concentrated fire or avoidance. For the Americans, Johnson's survival became legend. Pilots whispered it in ready rooms. The milk bottle had teeth. The flying pig was no joke. They began to trust the bulk, to lean into the power, to understand the philosophy of their machine. Don't turn. Don't climb at low altitude. Dive. Hit hard. Use the guns. Get out. Hub Zemke codified the doctrine. Boom and zoom. From high altitude, P-47s rolled inverted, dove at terrifying speeds, and unleashed a storm of fire. At the bottom of the dive, they pulled into zoom climbs, carrying momentum skyward. German fighters tried to follow, but their engines gasped for oxygen. Their wings shuddered at speeds beyond their design. Nothing in the Luftwaffe arsenal could match a Thunderbolt in a dive. The Americans learned fast. Within weeks, rookie pilots became hunters. Walker Bud Mahurin executed the new tactics flawlessly, earning his ace status in record time. He called it the turkey shoot. To Germans who survived, it was less humorous. They described the converging lines of tracers as a wall of lead, impossible to dodge, shredding aircraft in seconds. The fat, clumsy Thunderbolt was transforming, and the men who had laughed now whispered warnings over radios. Achtung! Jabos! Thunderbolts above! By late summer 1943, the Luftwaffe could no longer deny reality. The P-47 was not a Spitfire. It was not a Messerschmitt. It was something new, something industrial, something terrifying in its own way. Its guns spoke longer, louder, more relentlessly than anything they had faced. Its frame absorbed punishment until pilots despaired, and when it dived, it fell like a hammer from heaven. The sky was changing, and the laughter was gone. By July 1943, the Americans had begun to shed their fear. The Thunderbolt was still a beast, unforgiving to careless hands, but now the pilots were learning how to wield it. The turning fights that had doomed them in April were abandoned. The dogfights of circles and spirals gave way to something new, blunt, merciless, almost mathematical in its simplicity. Hubert Hub Zemke drilled it into his men with the intensity of a preacher. Don't turn with them. Don't climb with them. Use your weight. Use your dive. Use your guns. The P-47 was not an elegant duelist. It was a heavyweight brawler, a machine designed for hammer blows. Where a Spitfire danced and a Messerschmitt jabbed, the Thunderbolt crushed. The doctrine was simple. Start high, stay high. Strike like lightning. From 30,000 feet, P-47s rolled inverted, pointed their noses toward the enemy, and dove. Gravity and horsepower combined, turning mass into speed. In seconds, the Thunderbolt roared past 500 miles per hour. faster than anything the Luftwaffe could follow. At that velocity, the Brownings became scythes. The convergence of 8 guns, set at 300 yards, created a killing zone 6 feet wide. Any German caught in it did not fall. He vanished. Pilots began calling it the Wall of Lead. To German survivors, it was exactly that. A curtain of red tracers, impossible to cross. Those who tried found their wings severed, their fuselages split, their cockpits shredded in an instant. Zemke himself executed the maneuver with ruthless efficiency. On August 17, 1943, during the massive dual raid on Schweinfurt and Regensburg, he led his men against formations of twin-engine Messerschmitt 110s preparing to attack American bombers. The German destroyers, bristling with cannons, were the terror of B-17 crews. But when the Thunderbolt struck, the hunters became prey. From 28,000 feet, 4 P-47s fell like hammers. The air screamed around their fuselages, controls trembling under compressibility, pilots pressing against the stick with every ounce of strength. Below, the Messerschmitt gunners opened fire, tracer streams reaching upward like desperate claws. A P-47 shuddered under hits, but kept coming. Then, the Americans fired. A German gunner named Heinrich Roth, who survived, described it later. The American fighters came down like hammers from heaven. I fired at 800 meters and saw my shells strike the wing of the leader. He did not even wobble. Then he fired. The aircraft ahead of us came apart. Not shot down, destroyed. In 2 seconds, it ceased to exist. 8 Messerschmitt 110s were annihilated in less than a minute. The Thunderbolts climbed back to altitude, reformed, and prepared to strike again. For the bomber crews watching above, it was salvation. For the Luftwaffe, it was revelation. The milk bottle had become a hammer of judgment. The numbers told a new story. Where April had seen American losses mount with little to show, by late summer the balance shifted. German pilots began filing reports of Thunderbolts that refused to die, that dived too fast to follow, that struck with firepower beyond comprehension. A veteran Luftwaffe officer, reading one such report, scribbled in the margin, "This is no fighter. It is artillery with wings." Robert Johnson, now recovered from his wounds, returned to combat with renewed determination. His survival had made him a symbol. He pressed the trigger of his Brownings with grim certainty, watching Messerschmitts explode under the storm. His gun camera films circulated through American squadrons, proof that the P-47 could not just endure, but dominate. Pilots who had once joked about running around their cockpits now boasted of their kills. Walker Bud Mahurin became one of the first American aces in Europe, mastering the dive and zoom until it seemed effortless. He compared it to hunting from a cliff. You don't chase them, you drop onto them, and when you drop, nothing can stop you. The RAF began to notice, too. The same men who had mocked the Thunderbolt's bulk now admitted grudging respect. British observers described its dives as terrifying to behold, like locomotives falling from the heavens. They still preferred the elegance of the Spitfire, but they no longer doubted the Thunderbolt's purpose. It was not grace, it was annihilation. The Luftwaffe adapted as best they could. They tried to drag Thunderbolts into turning fights, to lure them low where climb mattered more than dive. They struck from below, exploiting the Thunderbolt's sluggishness in vertical ascents. For a time, it worked. American pilots who forgot their doctrine, who tried to fight like knights in duels, paid the price, but the lesson spread quickly. Never play the Germans' game. Play the Thunderbolts. Dive. Kill. Climb. Repeat. By September, Luftwaffe pilots whispered warnings to each other. Don't let them above you. Don't let them dive. The fear crept into their voices. One ace compared the experience to standing on tracks as a train approached. You could dodge once, maybe twice, but eventually the wall of steel found you. And when it did, there was nothing left but wreckage. In mess halls across England, American pilots began to share a new kind of humor. They no longer laughed nervously about milk bottles or pregnant cows. Now they joked about German faces when the tracers came. They told stories of wings shearing away, of engines bursting into fireballs. They spoke of Roosevelt's piano, the 8 Brownings hammering in harmony, and laughed with pride. But beneath the bravado, they remembered the silence of April. The names on chalkboards, the empty bunks. They knew the Thunderbolt was not invincible. It was unforgiving, merciless even to its own pilots. One mistake in a dive, one pull too late, and compressibility would lock the controls like stone. More than one rookie had slammed into the earth, victim of the same speed that made the P-47 lethal. The Thunderbolt gave no second chances. But if mastered, it gave victory. By autumn 1943, the Luftwaffe no longer laughed. Reports piled on Reichsmarshal Göring's desk, painting the same picture. A machine that could not be ignored. Exceptional at high altitude. Nearly indestructible when hit. Firepower that shredded aircraft and morale alike. The tone of the reports shifted from mockery to alarm. The Luftwaffe had underestimated the Americans once. They would not do so again. But by then, it was already too late. The tide was turning. The P-47 had entered the war as a joke. It was becoming a nightmare. And for those who had laughed in April, the memory of red tracers burning through the sky would haunt every mission afterward. The wall of lead was real, and it was only growing stronger. By the fall of 1943, the war in the skies had shifted altitude. Where once the Luftwaffe ruled at medium levels, striking bombers and fighters with speed and agility, now battles climbed higher and higher into the stratosphere. It was here, above 25,000 feet, that the P-47 Thunderbolt revealed its most terrifying advantage. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine, fed by a turbo-supercharger system that wound its way through ducts in the fuselage, did what German engines could not. It breathed at altitude. Where the Daimler-Benz and BMW power plants gasped in thin air, the R2800 roared. It delivered sea-level performance above 30,000 feet, a realm where Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs struggled like fish pulled from water. American pilots discovered the truth during escorts deep into France. At 28,000 feet, their Thunderbolts remained steady, their engines still pushing power into massive propellers. The Luftwaffe climbed to meet them, only to find their fighters sluggish, controls heavy, engines wheezing. Suddenly, the battlefield belonged to the Americans. It was here that Robert Johnson's story turned from legend to weapon. On October 8, 1943, one of Germany's greatest aces, Oberleutnant Hans Philipp of Jagdgeschwader 1, led his Focke-Wulf 190s against a formation of American bombers. Philipp was no ordinary pilot. With over 200 confirmed victories, he was a master of survival, a survivor of Poland, France, Britain, and Russia. His name carried weight like thunder in the Luftwaffe. But that day, at 28,000 feet over Bremen, Philipp met the Thunderbolt. From 31,000 feet, Johnson rolled into his dive. The Thunderbolt screamed downward, tracers glowing red against the pale sky. Philipp turned, tried to pull his Focke-Wulf into an escape climb, but the thin air betrayed him. His BMW 801 engine coughed and starved. The controls responded like stone. Johnson squeezed the trigger. His report was clinical. Opened fire at 300 yards, 30-degree deflection. Observed strikes along entire fuselage. Enemy aircraft exploded. No parachute observed. In seconds, Hans Philipp was gone. No ace's instincts, no years of combat experience could overcome the altitude advantage, the weight of the Thunderbolt, or the sheer mass of fire it carried. The Luftwaffe reeled. If one of their best could be erased so suddenly, what chance did ordinary pilots have? The German High Command demanded answers. Reports came back with chilling conclusions. The Thunderbolt's ceiling exceeded 42,000 feet, higher than any German fighter could reach. Its dive speed approached the sound barrier. Its armor shrugged off hits. It was simply indestructible in the ways that mattered. For American pilots, this revelation was intoxicating. They were no longer lambs sent into slaughter. They were predators in the high sky. They began to look down on their enemies, literally and figuratively. The air war was changing, and the thin blue stratosphere now belonged to the P-47. If altitude had revealed the Thunderbolt's hidden strength, technology soon amplified it. In January 1944, a new variant rolled onto English airfields, the P-47D-22, equipped with a Hamilton Standard hydromatic paddle blade propeller. The blades were massive, 13 feet across, broad and thick like oars. They bit the air with ferocity. Where older Thunderbolts had climbed reluctantly, the new propellers transformed the beast. Climb rates soared from an anemic 2,200 feet per minute to nearly 3,000. Acceleration improved. Suddenly, the Thunderbolt could meet Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs on their own vertical terms, and it sounded different. The new propeller created a low, rolling thunder that echoed across the sky. German ground troops began to identify Thunderbolts not by sight, but by sound. A deep, menacing rumble, like distant artillery that grew louder until it filled the air. They called it Donnerschlag, thunderclap. Veterans who had once joked about flying pigs now shivered when they heard that sound. It meant death was coming. By spring 1944, the P-47 had matured into something Germany had never faced. A fighter that could climb, dive, and strike with equal ferocity. At 30,000 feet, it owned the stratosphere. At low altitudes, it tore through trains, trucks, and tanks. It was no longer a curiosity. It was the backbone of daylight dominance. And then came D-Day. June 6, 1944. Over 500 P-47s flew cover for the invasion, from sea level to 30,000 feet. Thunderbolts stacked in layers above the beaches of Normandy. German fighters tried to break through, desperate to reach the vulnerable landing zones. Few returned. Oberleutnant Wolfgang Fischer of JG-2 recalled the horror. The sky belonged to the Americans. Thunderbolts were everywhere. We tried to break through at dawn. 12 fighters in my Gruppe. I was the only one to return. They were waiting at every altitude. You could not climb over them. You could not dive under them. Their guns turned our machines into rain. On the beaches below, Allied soldiers looked up and saw the sky striped with contrails, red tracers flashing like lightning. The Thunderbolt was no longer laughed at. It was feared, respected, and, for the men on the sand, adored. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, was reduced to shadows. Their attempts to strike were shredded before they could reach their targets. And in the weeks after D-Day, the Thunderbolts proved their versatility again. They left the high sky to the P-51 Mustangs and dove toward the earth with bombs and rockets strapped under their wings. Columns of German trucks, trains, and tanks were erased in minutes. Villagers whispered about the Jabos, Jagdbombers, that came low enough for you to see the whites of the pilot's eyes before unleashing storms of fire. Wehrmacht troops, huddled in ditches, praying to avoid the red tracers, the screaming rockets, the rumbling thunder overhead. By mid-1944, the laughter of 1943 was a memory, replaced by dread. When soldiers heard the thunder, they dove for cover. When pilots heard Roosevelt's piano, they knew death had come calling. The milk bottle had become the thunderclap, and the sky, once mocked, now shook with fear. The summer of 1944 turned France into a graveyard of German steel. The Thunderbolt, once mocked for its size, had become a predator of the earth as much as of the sky. No road was safe, no convoy secure, no train immune. The Americans had found the second life of their beast, the ground attack role. The D-25 variant carried bombs equal to early war medium bombers, 2 1,000-pounders under the wings, another 500 beneath the fuselage. Rockets sprouted from stubs like teeth, 10 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets, each with the explosive force of an artillery shell, and always the 8 Brownings, waiting to rip open anything with wheels or tracks. Columns of Wehrmacht trucks moving by daylight were massacred. One pass, one squeeze of the trigger, and fire erupted across miles of highway. Trains became pyres. Tanks were left smoldering carcasses, their crews dead or fleeing. German soldiers began to speak in hushed tones about the Jabos. "They come low, so low you see their faces," one grenadier wrote in his diary. Then the sound. Rockets scream, guns thunder, and the column disappears. It is not battle. It is slaughter. The numbers were staggering. In June alone, 9th Air Force Thunderbolts destroyed 651 locomotives, nearly 4,000 trucks, over 500 tanks. The Germans tried to reinforce armor, camouflage roads, move only at night. But the Thunderbolts adapted. They struck bridges, rail lines, fuel depots. Anywhere, movement pulsed. The hammer fell. Psychologists in the Wehrmacht began to notice something new among soldiers. Symptoms of panic before missions, trembling, nausea, even fevers when reports of Jabos circulated nearby. They called it Jabo-jagged fever, Jabo fever. It spread like an invisible disease. Hardened veterans who had faced Spitfires and hurricanes without fear grew sick at the sound of approaching thunderbolts. The deep, rolling roar triggered a physical response. Stomachs knotted, hands shook, eyes watered. One Feldwebel confessed after the war, "I could face tanks. I could face artillery. But when I heard that thunder, I wanted only to hide." It was not combat. It was judgment. For the Americans, the role was brutal but effective. Pilots returned with gun camera footage of columns exploding under their fire. Film reels shown in briefings like trophies. They joked about being flying artillery, about making the Luftwaffe irrelevant by destroying everything on the ground before planes could take off. Yet in quiet moments, some admitted discomfort, the ease of destruction, the helplessness of men below, the screams cut short by fire. The war had stripped away illusions. In the P-47, you did not duel. You erased. By autumn, German strategy collapsed under the weight of steel. Divisions starved of fuel. Trains abandoned on ruined tracks. Armor rusting where it was destroyed. The Thunderbolt had become the hand of attrition. The proof of America's industrial will turned into fire and lead. And always, in the memories of those who faced it, was the sound. The thunderclap that meant death. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe was desperate. Fuel was scarce, pilots were young and untrained, and the skies were owned by the Allies. But Germany still had one card left to play. The jet, the Messerschmitt Me 262, was a marvel of engineering. A sleek predator with a top speed over 500 miles per hour. Against any propeller-driven fighter, it should have been untouchable. German propaganda hailed it as the miracle weapon, the Wunderwaffe that would reverse the tide. But the Thunderbolt was waiting. The P-47 could not outpace the jet, but it could dive. From high altitude, it hurled itself downward with gravity and horsepower until speed blurred vision and wings screamed in protest. It was in those dives, and in the vulnerable moments when jets took off or landed, that Thunderbolt pilots struck. On November 27, 1944, Lieutenant Colonel John C. Meyer of the 352nd Fighter Group caught a Me-262 in level flight. Diving from 28,000 feet, his Thunderbolt reached nearly 500 miles per hour, close enough to close the gap. At 400 yards, he fired. The German jet erupted, engines tearing free, fuselage splitting into fragments. Meyer wrote in his report with cold precision, "The aircraft disintegrated under fire. No parachute observed. Jets proved terrifying but fragile. Their engines flamed out easily, their acceleration poor at low speed, their frames vulnerable to .50 caliber fire. Thunderbolts, heavier but steadier, exploited those moments with merciless discipline." By early 1945, new variants like the P-47M with water methanol injection pushed speeds higher, enough to intercept even jets under certain conditions. German hopes dwindled. Each new pilot sent to a staffel lasted fewer missions. Each miracle weapon was met by mass, by firepower, by the avalanche of American industry. Then came January 1st, 1945, Operation Bodenplatte, the Luftwaffe's last desperate strike. Nearly 900 fighters launched surprise attacks on Allied airfields across Belgium and the Netherlands. At Y-34 near Metz, home to the 365th Fighter Group, the attack began with flames. 22 Thunderbolts destroyed on the ground, smoke rising over the field. A captured German pilot, brought before the American commander, sneered. "What do you think of that?" Major George Brooking pointed to the wrecks being cleared, to the ground crews already preparing spaces for replacements. His words became legend. "By tomorrow, we'll have 40 new ones. How long will it take you to replace your pilots?" The Germans' smirk faded. Within 48 hours, fresh P-47D-40s filled the field, flown in from depots across England. The Luftwaffe, in contrast, had lost 271 aircraft and 213 irreplaceable pilots. Bodenplatte was supposed to cripple Allied air power. Instead, it broke the Luftwaffe's back. From that day forward, German pilots knew the truth. The Thunderbolt was not just a machine. It was a symbol of America's strength, of production lines that never stopped, of training programs that filled cockpits faster than Germany could empty them. For every 10 P-47s lost, 20 more appeared. For every ace shot down, another farm boy, another college student, another factory worker arrived, trained, fueled, and armed. The Luftwaffe had courage. The Americans had infinity, and courage without resources is only delayed defeat. By early 1945, the statistics of American production dwarfed anything the Luftwaffe could comprehend. Where German assembly lines struggled to replace even a handful of aircraft each month, Republic Aviation was producing Thunderbolts at an industrial rhythm that seemed mechanical, inhuman. At Farmingdale, Long Island, a new P-47 rolled out every hour. In Evansville, Indiana, a factory built on farmland in 1942 now pushed out 500 machines every month. The numbers were staggering. 15,683 Thunderbolts produced by war's end, more than any other American fighter. Each aircraft demanded 65,000 individual parts, 8 miles of electrical wiring, thousands of pounds of aluminum and rubber. The R-2800 engine alone contained 2,400 components, machined to impossible tolerances. And yet, housewives who had never seen an aircraft before the war assembled them with precision, guided by manuals, driven by urgency. While Germany rationed ammunition, American pilots trained with it in abundance. While German cadets flew into combat with barely 100 hours of flight time, American rookies arrived in Europe with 400, sometimes more. They had practiced deflection shooting on moving targets, studied film from gun cameras, flown in formations until the maneuvers were instinct. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of Europe, was being strangled by attrition. Every lost pilot was a catastrophe. Every destroyed aircraft a gap that could never be filled. The Americans, by contrast, replaced losses before the wrecks cooled. captured German pilots after Bodenplatte expressed disbelief when they saw fresh Thunderbolts replacing burned-out hulks in less than a day. One asked bitterly, "Do you grow them from trees?" But it wasn't just numbers. It was philosophy. The Americans had built a machine designed for war of attrition. Every inch of the P-47 was over-engineered to survive, to deliver punishment, to keep flying when logic said it should fall. By March 1945, the files on the Thunderbolt in German intelligence headquarters no longer mocked it. They recorded the truth with reluctant precision. Best fighter bomber of the war. Combination of firepower, durability, and performance unmatched. Pilot quality exceptional. Assessment unsurvivable in direct engagement. The laughter of 1943 had become silence. Then fear. And, finally, resignation. For the Luftwaffe, the war in the sky was over, even if some continued to fly. By spring 1945, the Luftwaffe existed largely on paper. Fuel shortages grounded many squadrons. Airfields lay in ruins, cratered by Allied bombings. Veterans were dead or captured. The new recruits, teenagers and old men alike, climbed into cockpits with less than 30 hours of combat training. When they met the Thunderbolts, the encounters lasted seconds. One German cadet, Klaus Brechender, remembered his first and only mission over Leipzig in April 1945. He spotted 4 Thunderbolts diving from above. He tried to turn, but they were too fast. The leader fired from 500 meters. My aircraft shook like hammers hit it. The engine exploded. The wing separated. I barely escaped in the parachute. In the sky, I watched them destroy my entire staffel in less than a minute. The psychological toll was complete. Reports from German medical officers described Jabo fever spreading like wildfire. Men became physically ill at the sound of approaching Thunderbolts. Hardened veterans trembled when the roar came. The mechanical thunder of the paddle blade propellers created panic before the first shot was fired. On the ground, Wehrmacht convoys moved only at night. Soldiers dug trenches not against infantry, but against aircraft. Columns burned, railroads shattered, armor reduced to twisted wrecks. Survivors described the sensation of helplessness. Fighting tanks at least meant firing back. Against the Thunderbolt, there was nothing but fire from the sky. And still, the Americans kept coming. Day after day, mission after mission, hundreds of Thunderbolts flew into German skies, burning fuel in rivers, consuming ammunition by the millions. Each month, the 9th Air Force fired 135 million rounds of 50 caliber ammunition. Each month, the Lake City arsenal produced 30 million more. For the Germans, courage had become suicide. For the Americans, the Thunderbolt had become inevitability. By May 1945, the Luftwaffe had nothing left. The mockery of 1943, the jokes about milk bottles and pregnant cows, had faded into memories buried under wreckage and death. A German pilot, captured in the last weeks of the war, summed it with haunted eyes. "We laughed when we saw them. We do not laugh now. When you hear those guns, you do not fight. You die. The sky belonged to the Thunderbolt." And no one was laughing anymore. The guns of Europe fell silent in May 1945, but the echoes of the Thunderbolt lingered long after. For American pilots, the P-47 was more than an aircraft. It was a companion that had carried them through fire, a machine that could take punishment and still bring them home. For Germans who had faced it, the memory was darker. A nightmare of thunder and fire that haunted their dreams for decades. At interrogation centers in 1945, captured Luftwaffe pilots were asked to rank Allied fighters. The early assessments of 1943 mocked the Thunderbolt. By 1944, the reports called it a critical threat. By 1945, the words were blunt. Best fighter bomber of the war. Unsurvivable in direct engagement. In the ruins of the Reich, pilots admitted what propaganda had denied. The P-47 had been underestimated, then feared, then hated. They called it Roosevelt's piano, the symphony of death played by 8 Brownings. They described the sound of its guns as mechanical, unstoppable, a rhythm of inevitability. One ace said, "Once you heard it, you knew." Someone was about to die, but there was also respect. Adolf Galland, the legendary general of the fighter arm, met his American counterparts years later. At a reunion in Phoenix, Arizona in 1985, he spoke candidly. "We thought it was a bomber pretending to be a fighter. We did not understand. The Americans had built not a European machine, but an American one, designed for mass, for firepower, for survival. It was perfect for the war they fought. When I flew it after the war, I understood. We never had a chance." For American veterans, the Thunderbolt became a badge of pride. They told stories of limping home with wings shredded, of engines coughing fire but never quitting, of bullet holes counted in the hundreds. They remembered friends lost, but also victories won, survival bought by inches of steel and horsepower. At reunions, men who had flown together laughed about milk bottle jokes, about pregnant cows that turned out to be angels of survival. Robert Johnson, the farm boy who had once prayed behind a frozen canopy, became a living legend. Zemke, Mahurin, Gabreski, names that once belonged only to squadrons, became etched in history. The war was over, but the Thunderbolt lived on. In memories, in museums, in the whispered respect of enemies who had once laughed. In the years after the war, Thunderbolts disappeared from airfields as quickly as they had appeared. The jet age had dawned, and piston fighters were relics overnight. P-51 Mustangs flew into Korea, but the P-47 was retired, its bulk unsuited for the new era. Yet, in memory, it never faded. At the United States Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio, a restored P-47D sits among the legends: Spitfires, Mustangs, Messerschmitts. Visitors read the placard, 3,152 German aircraft destroyed in aerial combat, 86,000 vehicles destroyed, 9,000 locomotives destroyed, 120,000 tons of bombs dropped. The statistics alone seem unreal, numbers so vast they blur into abstraction. But nearby, in a glass case, are objects that tell the story more clearly. A strip of gun camera film showing a Focke-Wulf torn apart in tracers. Spent .50 caliber casings, dull with age, but still heavy in the hand. And beneath them, a quote from an unnamed German pilot. "We laughed when we first saw them. Fat, ugly American fighters. We stopped laughing when they pointed those guns. You did not fight them. You ceased to exist." The Thunderbolt became more than a machine. It became a symbol of America's industrial philosophy. Brute force engineering backed by infinite production. Its design was not elegant, but it was relentless. Its wings were built to carry loads triple its weight. Its engines built to climb until oxygen itself gave out. Its guns built to fire without pause until nothing remained. For historians, the Thunderbolt marked the triumph of attrition over elegance. For veterans, it was the sound of survival. For enemies, it was the sound of doom. Even decades later, German survivors spoke of it in hushed tones. Some said the roar haunted their dreams. Some said they could still hear Roosevelt's piano when storms rolled across the sky. The Thunderbolt had entered the war as a joke. It ended it as a legend, and in the end, perhaps the truest tribute came from those who had once mocked it. Adolf Galland's words lingered. "The P-47 did not just defeat us, it buried us, under steel, under fire, under the weight of America itself." The P-47 Thunderbolt was never the most beautiful aircraft of the Second World War. It lacked the curves of the Spitfire, the sleek lines of the Mustang, the menace of the Messerschmitt 109. It was big, it was heavy, and it was mocked even by its own pilots in training. But in the crucible of combat, beauty meant nothing. Survival and firepower meant everything. The Thunderbolt was survival incarnate. It could take punishment that would disintegrate lighter machines. It could dive faster than anything else in the sky, trading weight for velocity, turning gravity into a weapon. It could fire longer and harder than any other fighter, spitting streams of lead until targets not only fell, but vanished in fragments. It also redefined strategy. Before the P-47, fighter combat meant turn, climb, duel. With the Thunderbolt came the era of energy fighting. Boom and zoom, altitude and speed over finesse. Pilots learned that wars were not won by elegance, but by overwhelming force delivered with ruthless precision. It wasn't just about the air. On the ground, it became the nightmare of the German army. Tanks, convoys, locomotives, bridges. Nothing was safe from the 8 Brownings, the bombs, the rockets. Entire divisions were immobilized, their fuel burned, their supply lines shredded. Soldiers developed jabbo fever, an illness born of terror. Because the Thunderbolt didn't just fight, it hunted. Historians later debated whether the P-51 Mustang, with its range, won the air war. But those who flew the P-47 and those who faced it knew the truth. It was the Thunderbolt that broke the back of the Luftwaffe. It was the Thunderbolt that taught the Germans fear. It was the Thunderbolt that embodied the American philosophy of war: industry, firepower, durability. When the Luftwaffe pilots who had once laughed admitted in defeat that they had underestimated the milk bottle, the irony was complete. The beast they had mocked had buried them. Decades passed, but the sound remained. Veterans remembered it not as a machine, but as a presence. The thunder in the sky. For Americans, it was the roar that meant salvation, that meant bombers would make it home, that meant they themselves would see another dawn. For Germans, it was the roar that meant annihilation, that meant there was no hiding place, that meant the end. At post-war reunions, former enemies shook hands and drank together. But when conversation turned to the P-47, the tone grew solemn. They spoke of its power, of its survivability, of the way it had changed everything. German aces admitted respect, even admiration. American pilots remembered with pride and with sorrow for the friends the war had taken even in Thunderbolts. In museums, the Thunderbolt stands silent now, polished and still. But to those who know, the silence is deceptive. Walk close, and you can almost hear Roosevelt's piano, the 8 Brownings hammering in perfect rhythm. Stand beneath the broad wings, and you can almost feel the rumble of the double wasp. Look into the cockpit, and you can almost see a young man, barely 20, gripping the stick, praying, fighting, surviving. The story of the P-47 is the story of transformation, from laughter to fear, from mockery to legend, from the milk bottle to the thunderclap, and in the final reckoning, it left behind not just wreckage, not just numbers, but a truth that endures. In the war of steel and sky, it was not elegance that prevailed. It was thunder. By 1945, there were no German pilots left to laugh. The sky belonged to the Americans, and the sound of the P-47 had spoken the last word. The laughter had died. The thunder remained.